All right, good afternoon, everybody. We will get started. This is Sharon Cowley from the College Board, and this afternoon we'll be going through the consent pre-administration and roster webinar. Our goals for today will be to review information about the pre-administration session. We will also provide an overview of the student optional questionnaire consent process, as well as share tips on planning for the pre-administration session and discussing student rosters and room planning. We are recording today's session and we'll make that recording available. If you have any questions while we go through the session, please type those in the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner, and we will get to the questions afterwards. So before I proceed, I just want to make sure everybody can hear me okay. If you can, if you wouldn't mind just typing in the Q&A box and confirming. Great. All right, so let's get started. So the first thing that we're going to cover is what the pre-administration session is. So the pre-administration session is going to allow students to complete the following activities on their answer sheet ahead of test day. So the first type of thing that you'll be doing is having students fill out personal information fields, such as their name, their FACID. For PSAT 10 and SAT, there is an optional questionnaire. And that allows students to opt into Student Search Service if they would like to participate in that. And then specifically for SAT, your 11th graders can select up to 4 colleges or scholarship programs to have their SAT scores sent. The student and or parent must consent to participate in the optional questionnaire portions of PSAT 10 and the SAT. And there is no consent for PSAT 8-9 because there is no optional questionnaire. So therefore, active consent is not needed in advance of the pre-admin session. The benefits of participating in the optional questionnaire are really centered around Student Search Service. For PSAT 10 and SAT, the optional questionnaires will allow students to opt into Student Search and provide information about themselves that allows them to connect with colleges and scholarship programs based on their interests. We have nearly 1,700 colleges that participate in the Student Search Service. They use the information to look for students who may match a range of factors. So where they live, the type of school they're interested in, what they plan to study in college. It's important to know that only eligible colleges and scholarship organizations can participate. Most often, they will search on expected high school graduation date, along with GPA and intended college major. The optional questionnaire has a number of questions that the students can choose which ones they respond to. And participation in the optional questionnaire is totally voluntary and optional, but does require a consent form signed by the student and or the parent. For SAT and PSAT 10, your 10th and 11th graders, as I mentioned, the questionnaire portion is voluntary, but Colorado law does require that students give their consent prior to completing the questionnaire. The consent is only required for participation in the questionnaire, so students can still take the PSAT 10 and the SAT test without completing the questionnaire. Consent letters will be provided in your pre-administration shipment for students or parents to sign. And if you need to, you can make additional copies of these. We will also be loading a PDF version of it to the collegeboard.org Colorado website. The state allows for the consent letter to be signed by either the student or the parent, and districts can set requirements that are more stringent than the state's requirements. If a student does not return a signed consent letter, then the school should proceed in assuming that the student or parent did not consent, and therefore that student should not participate in the optional questionnaire. And again, this is for PSAT 10 and SAT. If your district has more stringent policies regarding obtaining active consent, so maybe your parent is required for signature, then you want to make sure you follow your district policy. The signed consent forms should be collected back from students and kept on file at the school until a student has graduated or left the school. Please do not return the consent forms to College Board or to CDE. You want to keep those locally at your school. So now let's talk a little bit about preparing for the pre-admin session. The first thing is to think about timing. Depending on the number of students that you have that will be tested, the session may be conducted by a test supervisor or one or more associate supervisors within your school if you need to conduct multiple sessions. If students are absent during your planned pre-administration session, a separate session will need to be scheduled with them sometime before test day. For SAT and PSAT 10, you want to allow enough time for students to review the student guide and consent form and discuss with their families. So when you get your pre-administration session materials, it's going to provide the student guides and consent form. You want to distribute those to students so that they have enough time to talk about it with their parents before you schedule your session. Before your session, you're going to want to collect the consent forms and then schedule your session anytime after you have the consent forms in hand. We do strongly recommend completing the session before test day. However, if it's not possible, students will have the opportunity to be able to complete the information on test day. So they'll complete their demographic information about themselves before testing, but then score sends and the optional questionnaire, if they want to participate in that, will be completed after testing. So you'll need to plan accordingly if you have students that need to complete those activities when testing is done. For PSAT 8-9, you can plan the session anytime after you receive your pre-admin materials. Because there's no active consent required, once you have the materials in the school, you can schedule your session with students. And again, we do recommend completing the session before test day, but if it's not possible, you can have them complete the information on test day before testing begins. So in your pre-administration shipments, you are going to get a variety of materials. Your pre-admin shipments will arrive the week of March 12th, and they will be labeled with a purple label on them calling out supervisor materials open immediately. You can see here for SAT and PSAT 10, there are similar materials included, and for PSAT 8-9, your pre-admin materials are a little bit less because there is no need for consent. So for the contents of the shipment, you will receive your answer sheets. Those will be blank answer sheets that students will use. You will get the answer sheet instructions for students, and this is going to be something that you pass out to students when you do the pre-admin session, so they are able to answer the optional questionnaire, as well as identify the codes for schools that they want to send their scores to. You will also receive student guides. These are what should be distributed ahead of time to students so that they can review information about the SAT or PSAT 10, as well as the student data consent forms. In the shipment, finally, you will also receive supervisor manuals and testing manuals. For SAT, those are separate manuals, so you'll get testing room manuals for both standard and accommodated testing. And for PSAT and PSAT 10 and PSAT 8-9, There's a single supervisor manual that includes all materials. And then you will also receive labels for each student pre-ID'd. So if you remember from some of the prior trainings, the labels that you are going to receive are for students that were included in your October count. Those are the students that have been pre-registered or pre-identified with the College Board. This screen gives you a sense of what the pre-ID labels are going to look like. They are identical to what you used last year. In the upper left-hand corner, there will be the student's SACID. You will also have their name along the top portion of the label. When you are planning your session, once you receive the labels, you want to verify the labels. Make sure that you've received the labels for your school by checking the AI code. Verify the student names that are included on the labels and the grade level. If the first and last name is incorrectly reflected on the label, then we ask that you not use the label. Instead, you're going to have students grid their information and securely destroy that particular label. If any other information on the label is inaccurate, it is okay to use the label. The only scenario where you won't use the label is if the student's first or last name is incorrect. The next thing that you will do once you've verified the labels is apply them to the answer sheet. And for this particular activity, we do ask that a member of the school staff apply the labels and not have students apply the labels. So you can see a snapshot here of each of the answer sheets, and the labels will go on the front of the answer sheet. You want to just position them in the box. The next step is to prepare your students. You're going to want to distribute the student guides and consent forms, as I mentioned before, and make sure that students have time to review them and especially discuss them with their parents. Collect the consent forms from students, let them know that they need to return those to school before they can participate in the optional questionnaire. And then they'll need number 2 pencils, and let them know when the pre-administration session is planned for. This is just a snapshot of what the pre-admin materials will look like that you'll distribute to students. For both SAT and PSAT, there'll be a student guide. This guide is going to provide information about the tests themselves, also give information to the parents to understand what types of information is asked on the optional questionnaire. And it will also give sample test questions so students can be familiar with what to expect on test day. The consent form is also a one-page form. As I mentioned before, you can make photocopies of this form to distribute to students if you do not receive enough, or you can download a PDF version to be able to print copies from that. So the next step, after you have students prepared, you're going to want to prepare the session yourself. So as I mentioned, you're going to apply the labels to the correct answer sheet type. And this is going to be important. So you are going to need use of your rosters to understand what students are testing with accommodations who might be using a large block answer sheet, as well as a printout of the students that will be testing with or without essay. When you're applying the labels, you want to make sure that you have applied the student's label to the correct answer sheet. You'll then need to create your plan, your room plan, for conducting the session. You want to think about how you will conduct the session. Are you going to use an assembly hall where you are having students do it in a larger group, or will you use classroom kind of small group settings to complete the session? For SAT and PSAT 10, you'll want to set a deadline for students to return the consent forms. And we recommend that you split your rooms based on whether students consented or not. That way, all of your students who will be completing the optional questionnaire are in the same room, and that'll just help facilitate the scripting that the person leading the session will be doing. And then from there, determine your staffing needs. How many rooms will you need to complete the pre-admin session? You also may want to think about having a separate pre-administration session, an alternate day, for any students who miss your initial pre-admin session. Arrangements can be made for students to complete the optional questionnaire on test day and complete their score sends, but it will save you time and be just a little bit easier if you have the ability to do that before test day. You do want to conduct the session in school. Please do not let students take the answer sheets home. These are the answer sheets that they will be using on test day, so we need to make sure that they remain secure. And then finally, you'll want to prepare staff. Assuming that you will use additional staff beyond yourself to administer the pre-administration sessions, you'll want to distribute copies of the manuals and help your test staff become familiar with the scripting. Each of the manuals provides specific scripting for students who have consented to the optional questionnaire, as well as for those who did not. You'll want to make sure your staff know what room they will be assigned to. Make sure they understand their responsibilities for conducting the session, and then review the materials that the students will use. So make sure you let them understand and view the answer sheets, what the labels look like, as well as the student answer sheet instructions. You want to make sure they understand which group of students they will be conducting the pre-administration session for, either students with consent, who have given consent, or those who have not, and then have them familiarize themselves with the appropriate script. You'll want to make sure that your staff also understands if you have not received a signed consent form at the school, that the students should not be allowed to complete the optional questionnaire. And then finally, provide your school's 6-digit AI code to staff so that they can post it for students to use, and they will include that on their answer sheets. There's an entire section in the manuals called Prepare Your Pre-Administration Session that will give you more details. When it comes to conducting the pre-admin session, for your grade 11 students who will be taking the SAT, you want to plan for approximately 60 minutes. You're going to distribute the pre-labeled answer sheets to the students along with the answer sheet instructions. And then students will have 3 parts that they will complete. The first is part 1, which will be their personal information. So all students, even those that have labels on their answer sheets, are going to bubble their name, their school code, their date of birth, address, grade, and STACID on the answer sheet. And the reason that we do this is so that we have an extra way to verify that the student responding on the answer sheet matches the student with the label. So it's just an added verification step that we can use. The second part of the pre-admin session will be for those students to provide their score sends, identifying what schools, colleges, and scholarship programs they wish to send their SAT scores to. So these 2 portions of the activities are available for all students. And then the third step of the pre-admin session should only be conducted with students who have submitted their signed consent form, and that is the optional questionnaire. In that part of the pre-admin session, students are going to use the answer sheet to complete questions about themselves. They'll have the opportunity to opt into student search and share information about their interests. So to complete all 3 parts of the pre-admin session, we ask that you plan for approximately 60 minutes. For those students that do not consent, your time should be considerably less. It'll vary depending on the size of your group, but I would expect probably for the part 1 and part 2 to take about half as much time. For your 10th grade students who are taking PSAT 10, you want to plan for approximately 45 minutes. Again, you're going to distribute the pre-labeled answer sheets and the answer sheet instructions, and then all students will complete their personal information. This is the same information that your grade 11 students will complete. Basically, it's their name, the school code, date of birth, their address, grade, and SACID. And then for those students who submitted assigned consent forms, they will also be able to complete the optional questionnaire. The timing is different here for grade 10 versus your grade 11 students, mainly because the questionnaire on the PSAT 10 is a little bit shorter than the SAT questionnaire. So again, that 45-minute estimate assumes that students will be completing both part 1 and part 2 of the pre-admin session. For your grade 9 students, you'll want to plan about 30 minutes. And on the PSAT 8-9 answer sheet, you're going to distribute those pre-labeled sheets along with the answer sheet instructions. The PSAT 8-9 does not have an optional questionnaire, so again, there's no signed consent needed. And all of your students will include on the answer sheet, they'll bubble in their name, their school code, the date of birth, address, grade, and SACID. So again, even if they have a label on the answer sheet, we request that students grid in the information as well. After you've completed the pre-administration sessions, for your associate supervisors, you want them to collect all of those answer sheets and instruction documents, confirm that students have entered their SACID accurately, and there may be situations where you have a student that does not have a label, did not know their SACID, so you may need to fill in their SACID afterwards. And then you're going to return answer sheets to the test supervisor. We recommend alphabetizing the completed answer sheets just so it makes it easier to find a particular student's document, and then sort them by testing room code if your school is using testing room codes. And then if you're the supervisor, you're going to take those answer sheets and organize them within your testing room groups before returning them to your storage boxes and securely storing them. So in each of the manuals, we recommend that you put together kits for each of the rooms on test day, so that all of the materials that your associate supervisors will need are in one place and you can distribute them. So when the pre-admin session is completed, you want to organize your answer sheets so that you can insert the answer sheets into those kits if you're doing kits, and then all of the answer sheets will be ready for your associate supervisors on test day. You also will want to track the students who missed the pre-admin session so that if possible, you can plan a makeup pre-admin session before test day. So one of the things that you will need to be able to do is just prepare for your rooms and understand the rosters that are going to be available to you. So this year, particularly for SAT, we have a fair number of changes to the rostering. And in both SAT and PSAT, we now have this concept that's called the master student list. And so we have instructed supervisors to create a master student list to help you with test day planning and to build your room rosters. So to create your master list, you're going to pull a list of all eligible students from your local information system. Basically, you want to capture the list of students who are required to test, whether that's for 9th grade PSAT, 10th grade PSAT, or 11th grade SAT. Once you have the entire population of students that will be testing, you then want to work with your SSD coordinator to use the NAR to identify students testing with accommodations. When you compare these two lists, it will allow you to identify the students that will test in a standard room. And so with that information, you can build out a student list. We have a sample here on the page. Similar sample will be included in your manuals as well. Your master list does not have to look exactly like this. We've provided an example, but you can build it based on your local system and what works best for you. We've called out some specific information for these lists to help you track your students, providing some identifying information for the students, leaving an area for you to mark whether students are absent or present on test day, the type of test that they're taking, so whether this is specific for SAT, if they're taking the SAT or the SAT with essay. If you're using a testing room code, you can identify that on here, as well as the groups and types of test books. So you can consolidate your information into a single list, and that will help you begin to plan your rooms and what students will test in which location. To understand which students are going to be taking the SAT with essay, you're going to want to access your detailed roster report once the window closes so that you can make sure that you've captured all of the students who have added the essay to their registration. And there's a section in your supervisor manual called Build Your Master Student List for Testing that will give you guidelines on how to map out this information. From there, you'll use that master list to create your room rosters. Once rooms are assigned and your staff has been determined, a roster will be needed for each testing room. So associate supervisors will have something to record students' attendance on test day. The associate supervisors who are testing students with accommodation will use the room roster to identify the appropriate scripts to begin with, as well as to make preparations for administering to those students. You'll be able to divide the master student list into individual room rosters, so definitely recommend using Excel or Word so that it's easier to kind of sort and organize your data. And then you have the option to build your roster using the master student list for students testing with accommodation, or to use a copy of the NAR as your room roster. In either case, you're going to use these rosters to track who tested and who did not test on the test day. You're going to want to continue to monitor your NAR in case there's any additional students who had late approvals of accommodations, or if you have students who transfer into your school closer to test day. And then in addition, your test coordinator and the SSD coordinator will continue to work together. Make sure that you have everybody included on the master list and you know which students will be testing in which room. There are some special considerations to be made if you are using an off-site testing location. So many of you may have requested approvals for off-site testing. Any school that submitted their testing plans, I know we are still reviewing and approving some of the plans. However, you'll get an approval, and for that site, you are going to have a test center code in addition to your AI code. So your AI code is going to be the same for your school and your off-site testing location. That just represents the school that is overseeing testing. But if you have off-site testing locations, you will also have a test center code for each location. For your supervisors and coordinators that are at the off-site testing locations, they're going to need to know both their school code and their test center code for filling out any paperwork for both the SAR and the SRF. You want to also make sure that your off-site testing staff go through training and that you have a plan for the transport of materials and storage of the materials at your off-site location to ensure that they remain secure that whole time before testing. We will be scheduling your pickups on test day from the off-site location. So if you're testing at your high school and you are not using an off-site location, that pickup is going to be the day after testing at your high school. However, for off-site testing locations, because they may or may not be able to secure materials for an overnight situation, we will pick up test materials the day of testing. It'll be towards the end of that day. Each location supervisor is responsible for ensuring that the off-site test center meets all of the requirements, and you will also have to build the room rosters for those off-site locations so that the supervisors or associate supervisors at those locations are able to track the students who will be testing. From there, you will also develop your room rosters, and you may choose to use something called the testing room codes. So testing room codes are new to SAT this year. You may remember them from PSAT 10 last year. But what testing room codes allow you to do is better manage the test day administration. It's simply assigning a unique code to each testing room. So you may have 5 testing rooms, and so you're going to assign a testing room code to each of them, and maybe it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That will allow you to organize answer sheets for the pre-administration sessions, as well as for distributing back to students on test day. The other benefit of using a testing room code is in the case of an irregularity. Let's say there is a disturbance that happens in one particular room. So of those 5 rooms that are testing, you have 1 room that had a disturbance and the other 4 were able to test without interruption. Having the testing room code will allow you to put that information on the SAR, and it will allow College Board a little bit easier way of identifying the students at your school who were impacted by that group irregularity. It also allows us to more quickly resolve and release scores. So for example, while we are investigating the room that had the disturbance, your other room scores would continue to go through the process. We wouldn't have to put everybody on hold while we investigated just one room's of activities. And the other thing to call out with your testing room codes is that for SAT, you do need to test need to test the SAT and the SAT with essay in separate rooms. So you would assign a testing room code for each of those rooms. Besides your master list, you're going to use the non-standard administration report, or the NAR. And many of you are already familiar with this from last year, but there are some changes this year which are new and different. So first and foremost, the NAR is going to give you a list of students who've been approved for testing with accommodation. SSD coordinators will have access to this report and be able to print the NAR from the SSD online dashboard. So if you were to log in now, for SSD coordinators, if they were to log in now, they would not yet have access to the NAR. The NAR becomes available about 4 weeks prior to testing. However, you can use the eligibility roster report until the NAR is available. But the reason you will want to look at the NAR is to identify those students who are testing with accommodation and mark your master student list with that information. For PSAT 10 and PSAT 8-9, there are 3 types of information that will be included on the NAR. The first is a summary of students and their SSD numbers. The second is going to be a list of students who will test during the accommodated testing window. And for PSAT, that is basically all of your students with accommodations will be able to test in the window. And then you will also have additional instructions for testing students with accommodations. Any extended information is included on the NAR as well. For SAT, the NAR is going to look different from last year and different from PSAT 10. So you will get a summary of all students and their SSD numbers, but it is going to be broken up into 3 sections. The first is going to be a list of students who will test on the primary test day. So any of your students that have an accommodation that require them to test on April 10th will appear in this section of the NAR. The second section of the NAR will list only those students who are allowed to test during the accommodated testing window. And then finally, you will have a section of the NAR that includes any students who are testing with state-allowed accommodation. And then lastly, any additional instructions will be included on the NAR for specific accommodation. So to take a look at what that will look like when you print them out or when your SSD coordinator prints them out, the first section, that is the background image here, is that summary of students, gives the SSD number. And when you run this report, it's going to automatically print out all of the pages or generate all of the pages. And the third section here is showing the list of students and their accommodations. So I mentioned earlier that you can use the NAR as a room roster, and this will be where you would do it. You will mark whether the student is absent or present. You'll check off and confirm the accommodations that they were given. And there's a page for each student that has an accommodation. So you would update that information for each student and provide that back, a copy of that back to the College Board. For the NAR, it's going to look a little bit different. So as I mentioned before, we're going to help you identify which students can test on the primary day versus the accommodated window. The NAR will also identify students testing with 1 or 2-day accommodation. We'll include the test book color, so you'll know which materials the student should be provided. And we will identify the starting script for the administration. The other thing is that the NAR will display students with approved accommodation who have been pre-identified in the bulk registration process. And you'll see what that looks like in a minute. SSD coordinators will be able to add students with approved accommodations to the NAR, so that this year for SAT, the NAR includes all of your students that have an approved accommodation. To run the NAR, and this is true for any of the assessments, you're going to go to the SSD online system, and so this is typically going to be your SSD coordinator. We'll log into SSD Online and choose to create the non-standard administration report. When that's chosen, the list will pop up asking the SSD coordinator to select the assessment as well as the test date. And so for SAT, you can see there's an example here of SAT school day. For PSAT, it's broken out separately. When you click on that, you will also be asked to enter your AI code or confirm your AI code. The NAR will then generate, and so specifically for SAT, this is where you're going to be able to manage the students that appear on your NAR. So there's going to be 3 scenarios that you may encounter when you run the NAR. The first is that no students are approved for accommodation. And the second is that all of your students that are approved for accommodations matched the students that were pre-ID'd by CDE. And then finally, there's a combination. Students that matched pre-ID information, as well as some students that have approvals, but that we couldn't match to a registration. So let's look at what that looks like. So the first case is a situation where there's no students approved. This could happen if you truly don't have any students that require accommodation. So you'll get the message that there are no students approved, and basically there will be no information to generate via a NAR. If you get this information and you think it is incorrect, you know you've submitted accommodations request, you expect to have a NAR, reach out to College Board. The other reason you could get this message is if for some reason there's a mismatch of what AI code your accommodations have been requested under versus the AI code that your students were pre-identified under. And so we can help sort that out if for some reason you see this screen. The next example is that all of your students matched. So let's say CDE enrolled, pre-ID'd 35 students. All 35 of those students had accommodations. We were able to match them with the information that was in SSE Online. So you would see a list of all your students, all 35 of those students. You would then click the Create SAT Non-Standard Administration Report to generate the report for printing. And that would give you your full list, and it would break it out for you which students tested on one day, which tested during the accommodated window, and what materials to use. However, the last scenario is you could have a mix of matched and unmatched students. And this is possible because you may have students that join your school after your October count. So remember, the students that have been pre-ID'd with College Board are students that were included in the October count. So there could be a situation where you have a student who is new to your school since October, they require an accommodation, and therefore we didn't get a registration, a pre-ID for them, so we couldn't match them. Another example of why this could happen is if the information when the student's accommodations were requested in SSE Online, if that student information is too different than the enrollment information that CDE provided. And so we want to make sure that we are aligning students to the correct information, and so we will ask you to confirm and take a look if need be. So for generating your NAR in this situation, it's going to be a two-step process. The first step of the process is that you'll see the list of students we were able to match. And in the example on the screen, there's simply one student here. But if you had more students, that would list out all of your students. And you'd then click Continue. The next screen that you will get is a notice saying that you have other students that have approvals for accommodations, and it will allow you to select which students should be testing. So there's a couple of things that I want to call out on the screen. Your SSD coordinator is going to need to have a copy of your master list or your the report, the detail roster report from the reporting portal so that they know which accommodations, which version of SAT the student is taking. And then they can simply go through, check the student who will be participating and the appropriate version of SAT. That way they can add any students that should be on the NAR because they will be testing. And what they'll see here is the list of any students that have the approval already in SSE Online. When testing is complete, the materials need to be collected from your associate supervisors, nothing new or unusual there. You're going to want to check the room rosters get the NAR, and check against the master student list, making sure that you are tracking all of the information. Basically, the master student list should help you identify students who were absent on test day, so you know who to request materials for, particularly for the SAT. But for PSAT, to make sure that you know which students are left yet to test with the materials that you have on hand. You're going to return copies of the student list and the NAR to College Board. The NAR is going to be inserted in the white testing envelope with your answer sheets when you return those. And the master student list or room rosters will be returned with your answer sheet shipment. Both of these documents we want you to keep a copy of, the master student list as well as the NAR, so that in case College Board needs to contact you or you need to backtrack to confirm if a student tests, you have all of the information that you need to be able to answer any of those questions. The other thing that you will want to do is keep your signed student consent forms on file, again, until the student either graduates or leaves your school. So with that, we have made it through all of the information in today's session. What I'm going to do is switch over to questions. So if you have not yet asked your question, please go ahead and enter it in the Q&A box. And let's see what we have that has come in. So first question is just about the PowerPoint itself. We will be emailing the PowerPoint to those who have attended, and we'll be posting it on the collegeboard.com/Colorado website. All right, let's see, next questions. For PSAT 10, are parents required to sign the consent form? So from a state perspective, the students can give their consent on the consent form. However, if your district has a more stringent policy and requires parental consent, in that case, you would need to have a parent sign. But from a state perspective, if your district doesn't have a more stringent policy, the student's consent is enough for them to participate. Next question is, if student gave consent for the PSAT 10 last year, can we use those same consent forms, or do we have to have them complete another consent for SAT? In this case, we recommend that you have the students complete the consent form again. The SAT questionnaire has different questions and additional questions from what the students would have seen in PSAT 10 last year. So we just want to make sure that the students know what the optional questions look like so that they can give consent. We had a question about your pre-administration materials and when will they arrive. So they will arrive roughly 6 weeks ahead of testing time, and so you'll be getting them in early to mid-March. The next question is, are there two different types of pre-administration, required and student choice? And so that's a great question. We talk about the pre-administration session as one thing. It's really kind of two parts. All students, regardless of 9th, 10th, or 11th grade, in the pre-administration session are going to complete basic information about themselves up front. For students that are taking the SAT, they will then also complete their score sense. Then for students who have given consent for the optional questionnaire for SAT and PSAT 10, will then complete the student choice part. So there are kind of two sections to the pre-administration session. All right, the next question is related to PSAT 8-9 and whether or not student questionnaire requires consent. And it does not. PSAT 8-9 students are simply going to grid their demographic information, their student information, and there is no optional questionnaire, so there is no consent required. The next question is regarding spring breaks. I know some schools will be on break during our standard delivery times or some of our standard delivery times. As a part of the school setup process, we collected spring break dates from each of the schools so that we could appropriately shift deliveries to work around your spring break timeframes. So you will still receive your materials and your shipping dates will be adjusted around your spring date deliveries. All right. The next question is, we have 8 new students who have just showed up. How do I request additional materials? So for the pre-administration session, you should still receive enough materials for those students. You will get a little bit of an overage on answer sheets, and the consent forms you are able to make copies of, and you'll get a small overage of student guides. So you may not have labels for those students because they came in after the October count, but those students can simply grid the information on their answer sheet and participate in the pre-administration session along with every other student. The next question is, it would be much easier, it has been much easier to have students bubble the answer sheet and then put the labels on to match, and then use the leftover labels for those who missed the session. Is there an issue with this? So there is no issue with that from a logistical standpoint. The directions that you will find in the supervisor manuals is to put the labels on first. The main reason that we recommend attaching the labels first is so that if students need access to their STACID, it is printed in the upper left-hand corner of the label, so they can simply copy it and grid it on their answer sheet. But as long as school staff are applying the labels to the answer sheets and students are gridding the information on the answer sheets, how you kind of work to marry that information up together is up to you. We're flexible in how you do it. The next question is, do you have to do a pre-administration session for the demographics, or can that be done before test day since it isn't that long? So in all of the information that you receive, you'll see that we recommend doing it ahead of time. And the main reason for that is for PSAT 10 and SAT, there is more information besides the demographic information that students have the option to complete. So we want to make sure students have time to do that. However, if you don't have the ability to do it before test day or students miss the pre-administration session, there is time on test day to complete that demographic information as well. The next question is, how long do the pre-admin sessions take? And so assuming that the student is participating in the optional questionnaire as well, you should plan 60 minutes for SAT, 45 minutes for PSAT 10, and about 30 minutes for PSAT 8-9. Let's see if we have some other questions. One question that came in is there a way to get consent forms before March 12th due to spring break? So we will be posting, and I don't think it's up there yet, but we should within the next week or two have the consent forms posted to the collegeboard.org/Colorado website. So if you want to get a look at that ahead of time, you could download the PDF version so that you could print and distribute ahead of time if that helps get it out to students. All right. The next question is there a list of accommodations that disqualify a score from being sent to a college? So for students that are taking the SAT, any student that has a College Board approved accommodation, so a student testing with a disability that is using an accommodation, those are College Board approved accommodation and are college reportable scores. The scenarios where students would not be able to send their scores or have college reportable scores are for any students that are testing with a state allowed accommodation. So if you have students that are using the SAAs, those scores will not be sent to colleges or scholarship organizations. All right, let me just take a look and see if we have any questions that I've missed here. We had another question related to accommodations. Just as a reminder, February 19th is the last day to submit accommodations requests for your students through SSC Online. There is a late request deadline that is March 5th for students who may be new to your school or have a newly diagnosed disability. So February 19th is when you should have all of your students with accommodations submitted for review and approval. All right. I think we have gotten through all of the questions. As a reminder, we will be posting the recorded version of the webinar and copies of this deck on collegeboard.org/Colorado. We'll also email a copy out to people who participated today. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining this afternoon. I hope you found the session helpful. And if you need anything else, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.